The scent of brine and distant pine still clung to the air, a phantom perfume that haunted my dreams. And on this particular, suffocatingly humid evening, seemed to weave itself into the very fabric of the port town. It was a scent I'd once associated with freedom, with the vast, unblemished horizon that had beckoned me away. Now, it tasted like ash. I stood at the edge of the docks, the setting sun bleeding a lurid orange across the water, painting the weathered pilings and the bobbing fishing boats in shades of fire and rust. My knuckles were white where I gripped the worn leather of my satchel, its contents a scant testament to the years that had passed. 10 years. A decade etched into my soul with the sharp clarity of a ship's hull scraping against rock. 10 years since I'd last seen him, since his voice, a low rumble like distant thunder, had promised forever. "I'll wait for you, Alara," he'd said, his eyes the deep, turbulent blue of the ocean on a stormy day. "No matter how long, no matter what, you'll come back to me." And I had. I had returned. But not as the girl who'd left, breathless with the thrill of an adventure and the ache of a stolen kiss. I had returned different, changed, carrying a secret that was as heavy as any anchor, as precious as any pearl. A gull cried overhead, a mournful sound that echoed the hollowness in my chest. The boardwalk creaked beneath my worn boots, each step a hesitant tremor of apprehension. I scanned the faces of the few lingering figures, weathered fishermen mending nets, a couple walking hand in hand, their laughter a sharp contrast to my own internal silence. None of them were him. Of course they weren't. He wouldn't be here, waiting on the docks like a character from a forgotten ballad. He'd have a life, a family, a future that didn't involve a ghost from his past. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The sea air, once invigorating, now felt thick and cloying, pressing in on me. I'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in my mind, each scenario a different shade of despair or, if I dared to dream, a sliver of hope. But reality, as it often did, refused to conform to my carefully constructed fantasies. The town of Port Blossom. The name itself felt like a cruel joke. It had once been a place of vibrant hues, of blooming gardens spilling over picket fences, of the sweet scent of honeysuckle mingling with the salt. Now it looked a little faded, a little tired, much like myself. The paint on the storefronts was peeling, the cobblestones were uneven, and a general air of quiet resignation seemed to hang over it all. I took a deep, shaky breath, the salty air doing little to calm the tempest within. I had to find him. I had to tell him. The weight of this secret had been a constant companion, a silent passenger on every journey, a shadow that clung to my every step. It was time to lay it down, to face the consequences of a choice made in haste and a promise broken by circumstance. My gaze drifted to the lighthouse, its white tower a beacon against the darkening sky. It was there, on a night much like this, that he had kissed me goodbye. His hand had cupped my cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of my jaw, and his eyes had held a promise that had sustained me through the lonely years, a promise that now felt impossibly fragile. "Don't forget me, Alara," he'd whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't forget what we have." I hadn't forgotten. How could I? He was etched into the very core of my being. But time, that relentless tide, had a way of eroding even the strongest foundations. A sudden gust of wind whipped my hair across my face, carrying with it the distant clang of a bell from the harbor. It jolted me back to the present, to the daunting task ahead. I couldn't stand here all night, a statue of regret on the docks. I had to move. I had to find him. With a renewed, albeit fragile sense of purpose, I turned away from the water and began to walk towards the heart of the town. The air grew heavier, with the scent of frying fish and wood smoke, familiar aromas that stirred a pang of nostalgia so sharp it almost brought me to my knees. I remembered walking these streets with him, his arm around my shoulders, his laughter a warm melody that had filled my world. My destination was the old inn, the Salty Siren, where he'd worked as a bartender before his dreams of the sea had pulled him away. It was as good a place to start as any. The inn was a low-slung building, its timbers dark with age, a faded sign depicting a siren with a mischievous grin swinging precariously in the breeze. As I approached, the murmur of voices and the clinking of glasses spilled out from its open doorway, a comforting hum of life that contrasted with the quiet despair I'd been carrying. My hand trembled as I reached for the worn wooden door, the weight of my decision pressing down on me with renewed force. This was it. The moment of truth. The culmination of 10 years of waiting, of hoping, of enduring. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior of the Salty Siren was exactly as I remembered it. A cozy, dimly lit space filled with the aroma of ale and pipe tobacco. The worn wooden bar stretched along one wall, polished to a soft sheen by countless hands. Lanterns cast a warm, flickering glow, illuminating the faces of the patrons, a mix of fishermen, sailors, and local townsfolk, their conversations a low drone that seemed to fade into the background as my eyes scanned the room. Then I saw him. He was behind the bar, his back to me, his broad shoulders filling out the familiar worn apron. The same dark hair, now a little shorter, a few strands of silver at his temples that hadn't been there before. He was pouring a drink, his movements efficient and practiced. The same fluid grace I remembered. My breath hitched in my throat. He hadn't changed as much as I'd feared. And yet, he had changed. The boy I'd left behind had become a man who, I prayed, still remembered me. My feet felt rooted to the spot, a desperate urge to flee, warring with the undeniable pull to walk towards him. The years melted away, leaving me with the raw, untamed emotion of that last night, of his promise. He'd said he would wait. He'd said he'd be here. A sudden chill, unrelated to the sea air, snaked down my spine. What if he was married? What if he had children? What if the promise he'd made to a girl on the docks meant nothing to the man he was now? The thought was a cold, sharp blade twisting in my gut. I took a small, hesitant step forward, then another. The floorboards creaked, a sound that seemed deafening in the sudden silence that had fallen over my internal world. He didn't turn. He couldn't have heard me over the din of the inn. My hand, slick with nervous sweat, reached out, wanting to touch his arm, to feel the familiar solidity of him, to anchor myself before I completely dissolved into a puddle of nerves. But before I could, a young woman, her hair a fiery cascade of curls, emerged from the back room, her smile bright and welcoming. "Can I help you, ma'am?" she asked, her voice friendly and professional. My gaze flickered from her to him, the man I'd come back for. He was still facing away, his profile now visible as he turned to speak to another customer. His jaw was set, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked different. Not just older, but heavier. As if the weight of years, of responsibilities had settled upon his shoulders. I'm looking for Liam, I managed, my voice a raspy whisper, barely audible above the ambient noise. The young woman's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a hint of something unreadable in her eyes. "Liam. Oh, he's right here." She gestured towards him, her hand falling back to her side as if she'd said too much, or not enough. He turned then, his blue eyes, the color of a stormy sea, scanning the room. They landed on me, and for a breathless moment, the world outside the inn ceased to exist. The noise, the people, the very air I breathed seemed to hold its breath. His gaze, so familiar, so deeply etched into my memory, widened with a dawning disbelief. His hand, mid-pour, stilled. The glass in his hand, filled with amber liquid, trembled slightly. Recognition. It bloomed slowly, then burst forth like a sudden storm. His eyes, those tempestuous blue depths, searched mine, a whirlwind of questions and shock and something else. Something I couldn't quite decipher. "Ilara?" he breathed, his voice rough, unused to speaking my name after so long. My heart, which had been a frantic drumbeat, now felt like it was about to shatter. I could only nod, unable to form words, my throat constricting with the enormity of the moment. 10 years, and here he was, and here I was. The promise, a fragile thread, stretched taut across the chasm of time. He set the glass down with a clatter, his movements no longer fluid, but jerky, uncertain. He took a step towards me, then another, his eyes never leaving mine. The inn, the other patrons, the world faded into a blur. All that existed was the space between us, charged with a decade of unspoken emotions. "Ilara," he repeated, his voice a little stronger this time, but still laced with wonder. Is it really you?" I finally found my voice, a tremor running through it. "It's me, Liam." He reached the bar, leaning against it as if his legs could no longer support him. His gaze, intense and searching, swept over me, taking in the changes time had wrought. My worn clothes, the subtle lines etched around my eyes, the weariness that I knew was visible. He saw it all, and yet his eyes held no judgment, only a profound, almost overwhelming shock. "You came back," he whispered, the words a confession, a miracle. And then, just as I was about to confess everything, to lay bare the truth that had brought me back to him, a small, insistent voice chirped from behind me. "Daddy? Daddy." The childish voice, clear and innocent, sliced through the charged air between Liam and me like a shard of ice. It was a sound that held no malice, no awareness of the 10 years that had stretched between us, no understanding of the fragile thread that had finally, impossibly, brought me back to this moment. It was simply a question, innocent and devastating. Liam's head snapped towards the sound, his storm blue eyes, which had been locked on mine with such intense, disbelieving wonder, widened further. A look I couldn't quite decipher, shock perhaps and something akin to panic, flickered across his features. He took an involuntary step back, his gaze shifting from me to the source of the voice. My own heart, which had been teetering on the precipice of shattering, now felt as though it had been punched clean out of my chest. A cold dread washed over me, a far more potent chill than any sea breeze could conjure. This was not how it was supposed to unfold. This was not part of the carefully constructed fantasy I had clung to through sleepless nights and sun-scorched days. A small boy, no older than 5 or 6, with a mop of dark hair that mirrored Liam's own, and eyes that held a startling shade of his father's blue, stood at the edge of the bar, his small hand gripping the worn wood. He looked up at Liam with an expectant gaze, his brow furrowed in a way that was achingly familiar, a miniature echo of Liam himself. "Liam?" the young woman with the fiery curls asked, her voice tinged with a new, unreadable curiosity. She had clearly overheard the child. Liam's gaze returned to me, a silent question in its depths. His jaw tightened, and I saw the familiar muscle twitch beneath his skin. The wonder that had bloomed moments before was now overshadowed by a profound, unshakable bewilderment. He looked at me, then at the boy, then back at me, as if trying to reconcile impossibilities. I felt the rough wood of the bar press against my back, a stark contrast to the dreamlike unreality of the moment. 10 years. 10 years of waiting, of hoping, of building a life on the promise of a stolen kiss and a whispered vow. And I had returned. Not alone, as I had always imagined, but with a secret that had just announced itself in the most startling, public way possible. My carefully constructed composure began to crumble. The raw emotion that had threatened to spill over moments before now surged with a ferocity I hadn't anticipated. I wanted to run, to disappear back into the anonymity from which I'd emerged, to undo the last 30 seconds. But my feet were rooted, my gaze locked with Liam's, a silent, desperate plea passing between us. He looked older than I had remembered, not just from the silver at his temples, but from a weariness that settled deep within his eyes. The cheerful, practiced bartender persona had evaporated, replaced by the man I had left behind, the man who had promised to wait. But he was also a stranger, a man whose life had clearly continued, taken paths I had never imagined. The little boy, growing impatient, tugged at Liam's apron. "Daddy, who's the lady?" he asked, his voice a little louder this time, drawing the attention of a few patrons nearby. A wave of heat washed over me, a blush I couldn't control. I was the lady who had returned with his son, the lady who had carried his child across oceans and years, fueled by nothing but his promise. Liam's hand, which had been reaching for me, faltered. He looked down at his son, a soft, almost pained expression crossing his face. Then, with a visible effort, he straightened his shoulders and turned his full attention to the child. "This," Liam began, his voice rough, as if unused to the sound of his own name being uttered by another. "This is Ilara." He looked back at me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Ilara, this is Leo. Leo. Liam's son. My son." The words echoed in the hollow space where my heart used to be. I managed a shaky nod, unable to trust my voice. My throat felt thick, constricted by a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion. Liam knelt then, bringing himself closer to Leo's level. He cupped the boy's cheek, his rough, calloused fingers a stark contrast to the boy's smooth skin. "Ilara is an old friend, Leo. Someone I haven't seen in a very long time." An old friend. The words landed like stones. Was that all I was now? An old friend? After everything? The promise, the years of waiting, the child we had created. Did it all amount to just an old friend? I watched Liam interact with his son, a pang of something akin to envy twisting in my gut. Leo's hand found Liam's, his small fingers lacing with his father's. The easy familiarity, the unspoken connection between them, was a testament to years of shared laughter, scraped knees, and bedtime stories. Years I had been absent. Years Liam had spent building a new life, a life that now included this bright-eyed boy. The young woman with the fiery curls, who had been observing the scene with a mixture of professional detachment and growing curiosity, finally spoke again. "Liam, maybe you should take Leo out back for a moment. Let Ilara settle in." Her suggestion was gentle, a tactful acknowledgement of the awkwardness that had descended upon the inn. Liam nodded, his gaze still lingering on me for a fraction of a second before he guided Leo away from the bar. "Just a moment, Ilara," he said, his voice low, a promise in itself, though I couldn't be sure what it entailed. As they disappeared through a swinging door behind the bar, the hum of conversation in the inn seemed to rush back in, filling the sudden void. The patrons who had been watching us now averted their gaze, returning to their drinks and their companions, pretending they hadn't witnessed the raw, unexpected unraveling of a decade. I leaned against the bar, the worn wood cool beneath my trembling hands. The aroma of ale and pipe tobacco, which had seemed so comforting moments before, now felt suffocating. My carefully constructed plan, the rehearsed words, the imagined reunion, it had all dissolved in the space of a child's innocent question. 10 years. I had waited 10 years. I had endured the loneliness, the whispers, the constant ache of absence, all on the strength of Liam's promise. I had returned, not just with myself, but with a living, breathing testament to that promise, a tangible piece of our shared past. And now I was faced with a reality far more complex than I had ever dared to imagine. The swinging door creaked open again, and Liam reappeared, alone. He walked towards me, his steps slower now, more deliberate. The initial shock had subsided, replaced by a quiet intensity that I recognized all too well. His eyes, those tempestuous blue depths, searched mine, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the boy I had loved, the man who had held my heart in his hands. He stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. He didn't reach out, didn't touch me, but his gaze was a physical presence, holding me captive. "Elara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it resonated through the din of the inn. "You said you had something to tell me." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken history, with a decade of silence, with the startling revelation of Leo. My breath hitched. This was it. The moment of truth. The culmination of years of waiting, of hoping, of enduring. I took a shaky breath, the salty air doing little to calm the tempest within. I looked into Liam's eyes, searching for the echo of the man who had made me that promise. He was there, beneath the lines of age and responsibility, a flicker of the boy I remembered. "Yes, Liam," I managed, my voice trembling, barely audible above the low murmur of the inn. "I do." I opened my mouth, the truth poised on my tongue, ready to spill forth, to explain everything, to lay bare the secret that had driven me across the sea, that had shaped my life for the past 10 years. I was ready to tell him about the joy and the fear, the love and the sacrifice, about the little boy who was waiting just beyond the bar, a boy who was both a miracle and a complication. But as I began to speak, as the first syllable left my lips, a small, insistent voice chirped from behind me, a voice that was not Leo's, but one that carried the same innocent, devastating power. "Mommy? Mommy?" The word, small and reedy, hung in the air, a sharp, dissonant note against the low hum of the inn. It was a child's voice, innocent and questioning, but to me, it struck like a physical blow. My breath hitched, my carefully constructed composure shattering into 1,000 pieces. My gaze, which had been locked on Liam's bewildered face, snapped to the side, searching for the source of that utterly unexpected sound. Standing just behind me, clutching a small wooden boat, was a little girl, no older than 5, with a cascade of fiery curls that mirrored the young woman who had initially greeted me. She looked up at me with wide, curious eyes, the same shade of stormy blue as Liam's, but untainted by years of waiting or the weight of secrets. Her lower lip quivered slightly, mirroring my own internal tremor. Liam, who had been leaning against the bar, his eyes still fixed on mine, stiffened. His own gaze shifted, following mine to the child behind me. A flicker of something unreadable. Surprise? Recognition? Crossed his face, quickly masked by a deepening furrow of his brow. The young woman with the fiery curls, who I now recognized as the girl's mother, stepped forward, a gentle hand resting on the child's shoulder. Her smile, which had faltered for a moment when I'd first spoken Liam's name, returned, though it seemed tighter now, a little strained. "This is Leo's sister, Lily," she said, her voice soft, directed at me, but her eyes flickered towards Liam. She's been looking for her daddy. My mind reeled. Leo. The boy who had called him daddy minutes ago. This was his sister. And Liam was their father. The realization hit me with the force of a rogue wave, knocking the wind right out of me. He promised to wait. A decade ago, he'd stood on the docks, his eyes full of a fierce, unwavering certainty, and promised he'd be here. He'd promised to wait for me, But life, it seemed, had not stood still for him. Life had continued, had bloomed, had created this, a family, children. The air thickened, growing heavy and cloying, pressing in on me. The casual warmth of the inn, the comforting aroma of ale and tobacco, suddenly felt suffocating. I could feel Liam's gaze on me, intense, questioning, but now also tinged with a new layer of confusion as he looked from me to his daughter, then back again. He had seen me, had finally truly seen me, and now this. Ilara. Liam's voice, rough and unsteady, broke the charged silence. He pushed himself away from the bar, taking a hesitant step towards us. His eyes, those tempestuous blue depths, were fixed on me, searching. Who is this? He asked, his gaze finally settling on Lily, a question in his tone that was both gentle and deeply troubled. The young woman, whose name I still didn't know, squeezed Lily's shoulder. Lily, honey, this is a visitor. Go play with your boat for a minute, okay? Her voice was calm, practiced, but I saw the slight tension in her jaw, the way her eyes darted to Liam's face. Lily, however, seemed more interested in the newcomer. She looked from me to Liam, her brow furrowed. But she looks like Mommy, she piped up, her voice innocent and startlingly perceptive. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Looks like Mommy. The words, so simple, so childlike, were a cruel twist of the knife. I was not his wife. I was not the mother of his children. I was the ghost of a past promise, a specter returned with a secret of my own. She looks like you, I managed to stammer, my voice a raspy whisper. I glanced at the young woman, whose face was a mask of polite composure, but whose eyes held a flicker of something I couldn't quite decipher. A quiet resignation, perhaps, or a weary understanding. Liam took another step, his gaze sweeping over me, taking in the worn fabric of my clothes, the subtle lines etched around my eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and harsh suns. He saw the weariness I knew was visible, the stark contrast between the girl he'd known and the woman standing before him. His eyes, however, held no judgment, only a profound, almost overwhelming shock. You came back, he whispered, the words a confession, a miracle, a question all rolled into one. He looked at me, truly looked at me, and for a fleeting moment I saw the boy I had loved, the boy who had promised to wait, reflected in his eyes. But then the man, the father, returned, his face etched with the complexities of a life lived without me. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to lay bare the truth that had brought me back to him, the secret I had carried across oceans and years. I wanted to explain the boy, but the words caught in my throat, a tangled knot of fear and regret. The young woman gently guided Lily a few steps away, towards a table where a half-finished puzzle lay scattered. Go on, sweetie, she murmured. Lily, clutching her boat, toddled off, casting one last curious glance back at me. The inn, which had felt so alive moments before, seemed to hold its breath. The murmur of conversations, the clinking of glasses, faded into a distant hum. All that existed was the space between Liam and me, a chasm of 10 years, of unspoken emotions, of a promise that had been both kept and broken. Liam's gaze remained fixed on me, his brow still furrowed, but the shock was slowly giving way to a raw, untamed emotion I recognized from our stolen moments together all those years ago. It was a yearning, a confusion, a deep, aching pain. "Ilara," he said again, his voice a little stronger, but still laced with wonder. Is it really you?" Finally, I found my voice, a tremor running through it. "It's me, Liam." I reached the bar, leaning against it, as if my legs could no longer support me. The worn wood felt solid beneath my hands, a grounding sensation in the swirling chaos of my emotions. His eyes, those tempestuous blue depths, swept over me again, a whirlwind of questions swirling within them. He saw it all, the journey I had taken, the person I had become. And yet, his gaze held a profound, almost overwhelming shock. "You came back," he whispered, the words a confession, a miracle. He took another step towards me, his movements no longer fluid, jerky, uncertain. He reached out a hand, as if to touch me, to confirm I was real, but then let it fall back to his side. And then, just as I was about to confess everything, to lay bare the truth that had brought me back to him, the truth about the boy who was now a man, and had children and a life I knew nothing about. A small, insistent voice chirped from behind me. "Daddy!" My heart leaped into my throat. I spun around, my eyes wide with a fresh wave of dread. Standing a few feet away, holding the same small wooden boat, was the boy. Leo. He looked up at Liam, his face a picture of innocent expectation. The young woman stood a little behind him, her expression unreadable. Liam's head snapped towards the sound. His face, which had been etched with emotion directed at me, now contorted with a different kind of shock, a dawning realization that was both tender and deeply troubled. His gaze shifted from me to Leo, then back again. The air crackled with unspoken words, with a decade of waiting, and a present that had just become infinitely more complicated. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, asking a question I couldn't answer. Not yet. Then his gaze fell back to Leo, who was now tugging at his apron. "Daddy, look," Leo said, holding up the boat. "I found it." Liam swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked at the boat, then at his son, his face a battlefield of conflicting emotions. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a silent apology, a desperate plea for understanding. I stood frozen, the weight of my own secret suddenly feeling immense, crushing. I had returned, carrying a promise and a child of my own. I had come back for Liam, for the man who had promised to wait. But the man I found had a life, a family, a future I had no part in. He knelt down, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving mine. "Leo," he said, his voice rough, choked with emotion. He reached out and gently took the wooden boat from his son's small hand. That's a beautiful boat, son." He looked at Leo, his gaze full of a love I recognized, a love I had once believed was meant for me. Then his eyes found mine again. He saw the raw pain, the dawning horror, the unspoken question. He saw me, Ilara, the girl he had loved, standing before him, a stranger in his life, yet intimately connected to his past. "Ilara," he said, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze locked on mine. I can explain." But as he spoke, as he looked at me with those storm-tossed blue eyes, a new voice, higher pitched and more insistent, cut through the tense silence. "Daddy?" My blood ran cold. It was Lily. She had wandered back, her lower lip trembling, her eyes wide with confusion. She looked from Liam, kneeling beside Leo, to me, standing by the bar, her gaze flitting between us with the innocent curiosity of a child trying to make sense of a grown-up world. Liam froze, his hand still on Leo's shoulder. The young woman exchanged a quick, unreadable glance with him. The inn, the patrons, the entire world seemed to recede, leaving only the three of us, caught in a tableau of unexpected parenthood and a decade-old promise. I looked at Liam, at the man who had promised to wait, at the father of these two children. The weight of my own secret, the reason I had returned, pressed down on me with renewed force. I had intended to reveal a truth that would bind us together. Instead, I had stumbled into a reality that threatened to tear us apart before we had even begun to mend. The promise, it seemed, had been a fragile thread stretched taut across the chasm of time, and now, with the appearance of these two children, that thread was about to snap. Daddy, the single word, innocent and clear as a struck bell, sliced through the charged air between Liam and me. My heart, which had been thrumming with a terrifying, fragile hope, lurched violently, then seemed to freeze altogether. The weight of the moment, the culmination of a decade's worth of waiting, hoping, and enduring, felt suddenly, irrevocably shattered. Liam's stormy blue eyes, which had just moments before held a dawning disbelief and a flicker of something I couldn't quite decipher as they searched mine, snapped away from me. His gaze, previously locked onto my face, now shifted, drawn by the small voice. I hadn't even heard footsteps approaching. The inn, so recently a blur of sound and faces, seemed to recede, leaving only the immediate space around the bar, around Liam, and now, around this child. He was small, perhaps 4 years old, with a mop of dark hair that mirrored Liam's own, though perhaps a shade lighter. His face was round and earnest, his eyes wide as he looked up at Liam, his lower lip beginning to tremble slightly. Liam, who had been leaning against the worn wooden bar as if his legs could no longer support him, straightened abruptly. The tentative steps he'd taken towards me, the raw wonder in his voice, evaporated as if a sudden gust of wind had swept them away. His hand, which had been reaching out, faltered, then dropped to his side. "Leo," Liam said, his voice rough, strained. It was the same voice I remembered, the one that had rumbled like distant thunder. But now it was laced with a different kind of emotion. Not just shock, but something that felt like a deep, weary resignation. He knelt down, bringing himself closer to the boy's level. "Hey, buddy." My own breath hitched. Leo. The name was a soft, melodic sound, but it landed on my ears like a physical blow. He was Liam's son. This small, innocent child was Liam's son. The promise. The years of longing. The imagined reunion. It all seemed to crumble around me, leaving only the stark, undeniable reality. The young woman with the fiery cascade of curls, who had been standing near the back room, now approached. Her smile, which had faltered for a split second when I'd asked for Liam, was now firmly in place, professional and bright. "Oh, Leo," she said, her voice a little too sweet. "Are you looking for your daddy?" Leo nodded, his eyes still fixed on Liam. "Yes, Daddy." Liam managed to smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He ruffled Leo's hair. "I'm right here, champ." He glanced up at me then, his gaze a fleeting, almost apologetic flicker. The intensity, the raw emotion that had been there moments before, was gone, replaced by a hurried, almost furtive look. And then, as if summoned by the very air of confusion and unspoken grief that had descended, another voice, higher pitched and more insistent, piped up from behind Leo. "Daddy!" This child was a girl, a mirror image of Leo in many ways, though perhaps a year or two younger. Her dark hair was pulled back in pigtails, and she was clutching a worn wooden doll. She ran forward, a blur of motion, and threw herself into Liam's arms. Liam caught her, his arms automatically wrapping around her small frame. He held her close, burying his face in her hair for a brief moment, his shoulders tensing. The inn, the patrons, the very air I breathed seemed to hold its breath once more. "Lily," Liam murmured, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just paternal affection. It was something deeper, something laced with a profound weariness. My world tilted. Leo and Lily, 2 children, both calling him Daddy. And then, Lily, still clinging to him, looked up, her bright, curious eyes finding mine. She blinked, a small frown creasing her brow. "Who's that, Daddy?" she asked, her voice clear and innocent. She pointed a small, grubby finger in my direction. Liam's head snapped up. His eyes, those tempestuous blue depths, met mine again. The shock was still there, but now it was overlaid with a dawning horror, a comprehension that was slowly, inexorably dawning on his face. He looked from Leo, snuggled against his side, to Lily, perched on his hip, and then back to me, his gaze sweeping over my worn clothes, the subtle lines etched around my eyes. The weariness I knew was visible. He saw it all, and in that instant, the fragile thread of his promise snapped. "Mommy?" Leo asked, his voice a soft whisper, his gaze shifting between me and Liam, a flicker of confusion in his innocent eyes. The word spoken by this child landed like a physical blow. Mommy. He was calling me Mommy. The absurdity, the cruel joke of it all was almost too much to bear. I, who had carried a secret child of my own across the years, a child who was not Liam's, a child whose existence had been my constant companion, my silent passenger, my shadow that clung to me wherever I went, was now being addressed as Mommy by Liam's children. Liam's jaw tightened. He set Lily down, his movements jerky, uncertain. He looked at his children, then at me, his face a mask of disbelief and something that looked perilously close to despair. The years melted away, leaving me with the raw, untamed emotion of that last night, his promise echoing in my ears. "I will wait for you, Ilara. I promise." The promise. A girl on the docks meant nothing to the man he was now. The man he was now had a wife, children, a life that had unfolded without me. The thought, cold and sharp, twisted in my gut like a blade. He had waited, yes, but not for me. He had waited for a life that had, in his absence, found him anyway. The young woman with the fiery curls stepped forward again, her professional smile now tinged with something unreadable. "Oh, Leo," she said, her voice a little strained, her gaze flicking between Liam and me. That's not your mommy. That's a visitor." Visitor. The word was a brand. I was a visitor. Not the woman he'd promised to wait for. Not the love of his life who had finally returned. But a stranger. A visitor in the life he had built. Liam looked at me then, his eyes searching mine, a whirlwind of questions, shock, and something else. Something I couldn't quite decipher. "Ilara?" He breathed, his voice rough, unused to speaking my name after so long. My heart, which had been a frantic drumbeat, now felt like it was about to shatter. I could only nod, unable to form words, my throat constricting. The enormity of the moment, the chasm of time and circumstance that lay between us, was a physical presence, suffocating me. 10 years. Here he was. Here I was. And here were his children. He set the glass he had been holding down on the bar with a clatter, his movements no longer fluid, but jerky and uncertain. He took a step towards me, then another, his eyes never leaving mine. The inn, the other patrons, the world outside the inn, faded into a blur. All that existed was the space between us, charged with a decade of unspoken emotions, of missed opportunities, of promises made and promises broken, or perhaps, simply, promises that had been outgrown. "Ilara," he repeated, his voice a little stronger, but still laced with wonder. Is it really you?" Finally, I found my voice, a tremor running through it. "It's me, Liam." He reached the bar, leaning against it, as if his legs could no longer support him. His gaze, intense and searching, swept over me, taking in the changes time had wrought. He saw the worn clothes, the subtle lines etched around my eyes. The weariness I knew was visible.